Hello friends, my name is Rudo. Our channel takes you on a journey through captivating stories, perfect for viewers of all ages and backgrounds. Experience the magic of storytelling as we reimagine ancient legends, bringing them to life with cinematic mastery that immerses you in the essence of African culture.
In a secluded hamlet, a spirited group of volunteers known as the Community Service Brigade had just wrapped up their year-long assignment at the local high school. Their days were filled with joy and fellowship, forming strong bonds with the villagers. However, as time passed, their curiosity grew. One sunny afternoon, as they wandered along the rustic paths, they chanced upon the majestic residence of the village elder. The sight of the imposing gates and intricately carved sculptures left them awestruck. But what truly captivated their attention was a dazzling golden tiara displayed within the residence. Its brilliance was blinding, like the sun itself. "That's pure gold," murmured Ibuka, the most covetous among them, his eyes gleaming with desire. "Imagine the fortune we could fetch for it in the city." Another volunteer at Nkechi shook her head firmly. "Don't even consider it. I've heard stories about this village. They say the elder's tiara is protected by ancient curses and spirits. No one who dares to steal it ever escapes unharmed." But Ibuka scoffed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Curses? Spirits? Those are just tales to frighten people. This tiara is our ticket to wealth." Some of the volunteers were tempted, while others were filled with dread. "We shouldn't tamper with it," implored Uche. "The village holds its traditions sacred. Let's not bring trouble upon ourselves." But Ibuka's mind was made up. "If you're too scared, so be it. But I'm taking it. And when I'm rich, don't come begging to me." Days turned into weeks, and the end of their service approached. On their final night in the village, while everyone was busy preparing to depart, Ibuka made his move. Under the cover of darkness, when the stars slept and the village was silent, he sneaked into the residence with two other volunteers who couldn't resist the lure of easy money. The tiara gleamed like a treasure from a dream. "It's even more stunning up close," one volunteer whispered, his voice quivering. "Hurry," Ibuka hissed, snatching the tiara and concealing it in a dark sack. "Let's go." Upon their return, Uche noticed the sack in Ibuka's grasp. "You didn't," he exclaimed. "We did," Ibuka boasted, his voice brimming with pride. "And I'm not giving it back." "You've made a terrible mistake," Uche warned, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand this village. You don't know what you've unleashed." But Ibuka shrugged it off. Mistake? The only mistake was not taking it sooner. The next morning, the volunteers boarded a hired bus, eager to leave the village behind. The sky was clear, and the villagers waved farewell, their faces beaming with smiles. Nkechi and a few others offered prayers for a safe journey, but Ibuka and his accomplices ignored them, laughing and mocking Uche, calling him Captain Cautious. Ibuka sat at the back, his sack tucked securely beneath his seat, a smug smile plastered on his face. He could already envision the riches awaiting him in the city. But as the bus rumbled down the dusty road, the tiara's golden glow remained hidden, a silent witness to the greed that had set their fate in motion. The bus trundled along the uneven road, carrying the volunteers away from the village. The morning sun blazed brightly, casting long shadows on the parched red earth. Laughter and chatter filled the air as the volunteers reminisced about their time in the village. But Ibuka sat quietly at the back, his sack clutched tightly under his seat. The tiara inside seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, though only Ibuka could sense it. Suddenly, the bus lurched to a halt with a loud, groaning sigh. The engine sputtered and died. "What's going on?" one of the volunteers asked, peering out the window. "The bus has broken down," the driver grumbled, climbing down to inspect it. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he tinkered with the engine. Hours passed under the scorching sun as the driver worked, muttering curses under his breath. Finally, the bus roared back to life. Relieved, the volunteers cheered as the journey resumed, but their joy was short-lived. A loud pop echoed through the air. "The tire has blown," the driver announced, his face contorted with frustration. He hurried to replace it, whispering prayers under his breath. The volunteers fanned themselves, restless and uncomfortable in the sweltering heat. Still, no one noticed Ibuka's sack or the hidden tiara that lay inside, its silent presence casting an unseen shadow over them all. With the tire replaced, the bus continued its journey. But as the miles rolled by, an unsettling silence fell over the group. The once warm wind now carried a chill. Ibuka glanced around nervously but kept quiet. Then, without warning, the brakes failed. The driver's panicked shouts filled the air as he struggled to control the careening bus. "Hold on tight," he yelled, but his voice was drowned out by the screams of the volunteers. The bus swerved wildly before plunging into a deep ravine. The crash was deafening. Dust and debris filled the air, mingled with cries of pain. When the chaos subsided, 3 volunteers lay lifeless, their dreams and laughter extinguished like candles in the wind. Others groaned, their bodies battered and broken. Rescuers arrived swiftly, pulling the injured from the wreckage. But as they counted the survivors, one person was missing, Ibuka. "Maybe he was thrown from the bus," one volunteer suggested, his voice trembling. "Or consumed by the fire," another whispered, shuddering. But Ibuka wasn't dead. He had slipped away from the crash, clutching his sack tightly to his chest. His legs carried him far from the wreckage, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. The golden tiara, still hidden in his sack, seemed heavier than ever, as if it knew the blood that had been spilled because of it. And as Ibuka fled, the shadow of his greed followed him, waiting to strike again. Ibuka hurried away from the wreckage, his legs moving swiftly as he escaped the disaster. After hours of walking, he finally found another bus heading to his city. Relief washed over him as he boarded, clutching his sack tightly to his chest. The new bus rolled along the road smoothly at first. Ibuka leaned back, thinking of the fortune he would make from selling the golden tiara. But soon, the bus began to shake. "Driver, what's happening?" a passenger shouted. The driver slammed the brakes, but the bus wouldn't stop. It veered to the side of the road before jerking to a halt. The passengers tumbled forward, shouting in fear. "It's the brakes," the driver muttered, shaking his head. "They failed." The passengers groaned, climbing out of the bus as the driver inspected it. Ibuka stayed silent, his heart racing. He knew something was wrong, but he refused to let go of the tiara. After hours of delay, Ibuka finally reached home, his sack heavier than ever. But tragedy had already crept into the house like a thief in the night. But deep within, Ibuka knew the grim truth. The radiant tiara was no ordinary artifact, and his avarice had unleashed a tempest he could no longer control. As dawn broke, Ibuka's heart was burdened with guilt, yet his greed remained unyielding. He shrouded the radiant tiara in a dark cloth and concealed it within his satchel. "Today, I'll sell it," he muttered to himself, his voice wavering. He exited his home, leaving his grieving family behind, and embarked on the journey to the marketplace. The path was long and arduous, but Ibuka pressed on, driven by his insatiable desire. The weight of the satchel seemed to increase with each step, as if the tiara resisted leaving the village. Then, the haunting began. From the corner of his eye, Ibuka glimpsed a shadow flitting across the road. He froze, his heart pounding, but saw nothing when he turned to look. Quickening his pace, he couldn't shake the feeling of being pursued by an unseen force. "Ibuka," a voice echoed through the air. He halted, his blood running cold. It was faint yet familiar. Turning slowly, he saw a spectral figure in the distance, his younger brother, Chidi, pale and hollow-eyed. "Return the tiara, brother," the apparition whispered, its voice carried by the wind. Ibuka staggered back, his heart racing like a drumbeat. He turned and fled, but more ghostly figures appeared, their faces contorted in sorrow. Some he recognized, others were strangers. As he reached the market, Ibuka thought he had escaped the spectral pursuers. But suddenly, masked figures burst into view, their towering forms casting long shadows. "Thief!" they shouted, their whips cracking through the air. "Return what you stole." The first lash struck Ibuka's back, and he screamed in agony. Another strike sent him crashing to his knees. He begged for mercy, but the masked figures showed none. "Please," he cried, "I'll return it." To the townspeople, Ibuka appeared to be thrashing on the ground, screaming at invisible foes. "Has he lost his mind?" someone whispered. Ibuka's voice rose above the market's din. "I stole the elder's tiara," tears streaming down his face. "I stole it!" The crowd gasped, their whispers turning into murmurs and then shouts of outrage. "He stole from our elder!" Ibuka, still tormented by the unseen masked figures, staggered to the sage's dwelling. His cries filled the air as the spectral pursuers followed, their whips cracking like thunder. He burst into the sage's home, collapsing onto the floor. The room was filled with the scent of herbs and smoke, a sanctuary from the torment outside. "Help me," he cried, clutching his back. "The masked figures won't stop. They're flogging me." The sage, calm and stern, regarded him with piercing eyes. "What have you done, boy?" Ibuka trembled, his voice barely audible. "I took the elder's tiara. It's here in my satchel." The sage shook his head, his voice grave. "Do you understand what you've done? That tiara is bound to the spirits of the village. You've brought a curse upon yourself and your family." Ibuka fell to his knees, desperate. "Please, I'll return it. Just make them stop." The sage began a ritual, chanting incantations and waving leaves over Ibuka. For a moment, the air grew still, and the masked figures vanished. "You have 3 days," the sage said, his tone solemn. "Return the tiara to the elder, or the curse will consume you and your family. This is your only chance." Ibuka nodded, clutching his satchel. But as he stepped outside, the masked figures reappeared, their whips cracking through the air. No vehicle would stop for him. Drivers thought he was deranged. With no other choice, Ibuka began the long walk back to the village, each step a torment. The masked figures lashed him, their voices echoing in his ears. "Return the tiara," they chanted. Ibuka's journey was a torturous ordeal. His legs were weak, his back raw from the lashes, but he pressed on, knowing that the tiara had to be returned to its rightful place. For 2 agonizing days, Ibuka walked. His body was frail, his back a mess of welts, but he kept moving. The path to the village seemed endless, and the tiara in his satchel felt heavier than the world itself. As Ibuka approached the village gates, the air grew dense. The masked figures, still following him, cracked their whips one last time and vanished into thin air. Ibuka stumbled into the village, his clothes tattered, his face streaked with tears and sweat. The villagers awaited him, the elder standing at the palace gates, flanked by his elders and guards. They had known he would return. The radiant tiara always called its thief home. Ibuka dropped to his knees, his body trembling. He unwrapped the tiara and placed it before the elder. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he sobbed. "I was blinded by greed. I thought I could escape, but I've paid dearly for my folly." The elder looked at Ibuka, his expression calm yet stern. "You have brought great sorrow upon yourself and your family," he said. "The spirits do not forgive easily. You have returned the tiara, but the price you've paid is steep." Ibuka's heart sank as he remembered his youngest brother and his father. Tears streamed down his face as he bowed his head in shame. The villagers murmured among themselves. Some were angry, others pitied Ibuka. But the elder raised his hand, silencing them. "He has returned what belongs to us," the elder said. "His greed has already punished him more than we ever could." Just as Ibuka prepared to leave, a messenger arrived, breathless and wide-eyed. "Your father has passed," the man said. "He died this morning." Ibuka's knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground. His grief was a storm, crashing down on him with no mercy. The villagers lowered their heads, for even they felt the weight of his loss. Ibuka left the palace, his heart heavy with sorrow. Each step away from the village felt like a stone being added to the burden he carried. He thought of Chidi's laughter, now silenced forever. He thought of his father, strong and proud, now gone because of his foolishness. "I cannot go home," Ibuka whispered to himself. "What home is there for me now?" He wandered aimlessly until he reached a vast river near the village. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Ibuka stood at the edge, staring at the rippling surface. His mind raced with memories. The joy he had stolen from his family, the lives lost in the bus crash, the fear he had caused in the village. The tiara, now back in its rightful place, had taken everything from him. "I have nothing left," he said, his voice barely audible over the gentle rush of the river. Without hesitation, Ibuka stepped into the water. The river embraced him, pulling him deeper and deeper until he disappeared beneath its surface. The ripples faded, and the water returned to its calm, quiet state. When the villagers learned of Ibuka's fate, they shook their heads in sorrow. His story spread far and wide, whispered by elders to their grandchildren, told by fathers to their sons. "Let this be a lesson," they would say. "Greed is a fire that consumes everything. It spares no one, not the thief, not their family, not their future." And so, the tale of Abuka and the stolen tiara lived on, a cautionary tale to all who dared to defy the traditions and spirits of the land.